Welcome, restless dreamer. You've just stepped into the shadows of sleep, where stories whisper and the darkness listens. I'm your guide tonight, your voice in the void, here to lead you gently into nightmares wrapped in lullabies. Before we begin, press like if you're brave enough, and subscribe for more midnight tales that blur the line between sleep and terror. Tell me in the comments, where are you watching from, and what hour has found you? I thought I knew what hard work was, but nothing could have prepared me for the isolation of Fish Point Cannery. The job listing promised steady pay, a few months of summer work, and a chance to save up some money before life moved on. Easy money, they said. I arrived in Kodiak on a gray morning, the wind cutting through the harbor like a blade. From there, a small company boat would take me to the cannery, miles from any town, miles from anyone who could help me if things went wrong. The boat ride was silent, except for the engine's roar and the occasional slap of waves against the hull. The captain, Murphy, was a weathered man with deep lines etched into his face. He didn't answer my questions beyond a few gruff murmurs, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. A few other workers were on board, returning from shore leave. They barely spoke, nursing bottles of something amber-colored, their expressions distant, almost hollow. When we reached the island, the cannery rose out of the fog like a relic of another age. Corrugated metal buildings clustered around the harbor, smokestacks spewing steam and chemical smells into the frigid air. The scent of fish hit me first, sharp, sweet, and almost nauseating, and beneath it, something else. Something faintly metallic and sweet, lingered. I couldn't place it, but it left a sour taste in my mouth. Inside, the dormitory was just as bleak as I imagined. Rows of bunk beds lined the narrow building, each accompanied by a small locker. The mattresses were thin and stained, the air thick with industrial disinfectant mixed with sweat and fear. My assigned bunkmate, Eduardo, a Filipino man who had been working here for years, gave me a half-smile when I arrived. "First time?" he asked, voice quiet. "Yeah," I admitted. He chuckled, but it wasn't funny. "You'll learn why we all come back even when we swear we won't." Before I could ask what he meant, the dinner bell rang, a harsh electric buzz that echoed through the complex. The mess hall was cavernous, filled with long tables and benches like a prison cafeteria. The food was as bleak as the dorms, overcooked vegetables, processed meat, and bread that tasted like cardboard. Workers ate mechanically, staring straight ahead, barely acknowledging one another. "How many people work here?" I asked Eduardo. "Hard to say," he muttered. He gestured toward a table in the corner where a group of men ate in complete silence, their eyes bloodshot and unblinking. "Those are the night shift guys in Unit C. Don't bother talking to them. Some have been here years. They don't sleep. They don't talk. They just work." I followed his gaze to the men. Their movements were almost unnatural in their precision. They handled their trays like machines, every motion exact, robotic. Something about them made my skin crawl. Orientation the next day was brief and sterile. The plant manager, Stevens, went over safety protocols and schedules. Most workers would handle the main processing lines, gutting, cleaning, and packaging salmon for long hours. The seventh day was technically a rest day, though overtime was always encouraged. He explained that leaving the island without authorization was strictly forbidden. The only trips off the island were company-run supply runs, and medical emergencies were the only exceptions. No one asked questions about the isolation, the lack of communication, or the strange rules. I felt a chill run down my spine. Months without regular contact with the outside world suddenly seemed terrifyingly long. The first shift on the gutting line was brutal. Hours standing, cutting through fish after fish, blood and slime coating my gloves and apron. The smell was overwhelming. Not just fish, but something chemical, almost sweet, that made my stomach churn. The other workers moved with a mechanical precision that left me unnerved. Some didn't even seem human anymore, their eyes empty, their movements flawless. During lunch, I asked Eduardo about them. He glanced over at a man working at a distant station. "Look at Martinez. He's been here for years. Never stops. Never breathes hard. The company calls it optimal workforce integration. Makes workers more efficient. Keeps them going. But it changes them." I laughed nervously. "Changes them how?" He didn't answer directly. His eyes were fixed on Martinez as if warning me silently. "You'll see," he said. A week in, I was reassigned to Processing Unit C for a special project. The night shift supervisor, Dr. Reeves, explained the work. Experimental preservation techniques on salmon. Fish were injected with a chemical solution, then monitored through various stages of treatment. The solution was clear, almost like water, but with a chemical odor that reminded me of formaldehyde. Workers wore full hazmat suits. The fish, once injected, turned gray-white, translucent, almost rubbery, and emitted an oily sheen. Dr. Reeves insisted everything was normal, that the final processing would restore the appearance of the salmon, but I noticed the older containers in storage, labeled with dates from previous years. Curious, I opened one. The fish inside looked exactly like the ones we processed that night. Gray, rubbery, oily, but they were warm to the touch, and when I looked closer, I could swear the gills moved slightly, like the fish were breathing. My hands trembled. Every older container I opened contained the same, some even showing networks of thin white threads running through their flesh. Dr. Reeves found me there minutes later. "Problem with inventory?" she asked calmly. I stammered, trying to explain. She only smiled faintly. "You're showing promise. Time to meet Mr. Stevens about a permanent position." Stevens explained the truth. The cannery was a research facility testing advanced preservation techniques under the guise of a fishery. The solution worked on humans too. Workers who stayed long enough became dependent. Their bodies and minds changed. Less human, more machine, immune to fatigue, nearly immortal, but trapped. The realization hit me like ice. The silent, mechanical workers, the precision, the obsession. It wasn't discipline, it was transformation, and I could feel it beginning in me. The fatigue fading, my aches disappearing, the edges of my thoughts smoothing out. I wanted to resist, but part of me didn't. By the end of my first week, I knew the truth. Fish Point wasn't just preserving fish, it was preserving the workers. And if I stayed, it would preserve me too, forever. The first night in Processing Unit C changed everything. The fluorescent lights above the lab were harsh and unrelenting, casting the sterile white glow over everything, and making shadows longer, sharper, and somehow more menacing. I worked alongside Eduardo and a few of the long-term employees, the ones who barely seemed human, their skin pale and smooth, their movements eerily precise. I noticed for the first time that none of them blinked in unison. Their eyes moved independently, scanning the room in tiny, mechanical motions. The solution I injected into the salmon had an odd warmth to it, like it was alive, and as I worked, I began to feel strange, a tingling sensation in my limbs, my thoughts slowing but sharpening at the same time, my body growing lighter, almost weightless. At first, I thought it was exhaustion or the cold, but when I touched one of the treated fish, it reacted, a small flicker in the gills, not reflexive, not dead, but aware. Eduardo noticed my hesitation. "They're more than fish," he murmured. "The solution, it preserves, but it's changing them too, and us." "What do you mean, changing us?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the night shift crew. One man's arm moved fluidly to catch a falling container without touching the floor. Another adjusted the injection tubing with a precision that was almost impossible. Their eyes were fixed, unblinking, yet they didn't see me. Or maybe they did. They just didn't care. I spent that night meticulously recording each stage of the procedure, hiding little notes in my pocket. But as I looked around, I noticed something impossible. The older workers, the ones who had been here for years, their movements were synchronized with the machinery, not in rhythm, but as if they were part of it. The conveyor belts, the injectors, even the humming fluorescent lights, everything moved with them, or they moved with it. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay in my bunk afterward, eyes open, staring at the ceiling. The sounds of the cannery at night were different from the daytime. The machinery quieter, yet more alive, almost breathing. Shadows moved in the corners of my vision, but when I turned my head, nothing was there. By the third night, I began to notice the change in myself. My hands, raw and bleeding from constant work, healed. My back no longer ached. My eyes felt sharper. I was faster, steadier. I started noticing the smallest details, the slight color changes in the fish, the tiny variations in temperature of the solution, the subtle hum of the equipment. It was intoxicating, but the more I improved, the less I felt human. My thoughts became linear, stripped of distraction, emotion. Fear still lingered at the edges, but it was faint, almost negligible. And yet, the older workers seemed to notice everything. They watched me without looking, aware of my movements, my hesitation, my curiosity. On the fifth night, I discovered the final truth. I was organizing storage containers when I found one labeled 10 years old. The fish inside were perfectly preserved, gray-white, rubbery, and warm. But they were more than that. Their gills pulsed rhythmically, their eyes faintly glimmering with awareness. And then I realized something I couldn't explain. Some of the fish were moving on their own, coordinating, almost communicating. Dr. Reeves appeared beside me silently. "You've seen it now," she said softly. "This is why you're here, not just for the research. You're part of it now." I stared at her. "Part of it? What does that mean?" She smiled faintly. "You've already started to change. The solution is in you just as it's in the others. Soon you'll understand what it means to become optimal." I wanted to run, to escape, but the compound inside me had other ideas. My limbs were lighter, my mind sharper. I could think in sequences I had never imagined, plan actions down to the smallest detail, and the thought of leaving left me hollow, empty, nauseous. My body ached when I considered it. Eduardo cornered me later, his face pale under the dim lighting. "I tried to warn you," he whispered. "Once it's in your system, you can't leave. You'll die without it." "What are you saying?" I asked, my voice cracking. He lowered his head. "It's not just the fish. The solution changes us. It keeps us alive, makes us perfect workers, but it takes something from us too. Sleep, emotion, curiosity, fear. We lose pieces of ourselves, but we keep moving, keep working, keep producing. Forever." I felt the words settle in my mind like cold water. The others around me were proof. Machines in human skin, eyes empty yet aware, hands flawless, movements perfect. Workers who had forgotten what it meant to be human. And now, I was joining them. Weeks passed in a blur of fluorescent light, mechanical motion, and the intoxicating hum of perfection. I learned to anticipate every movement of the machinery. My body never tired. My thoughts became linear, efficient. I watched the fish transform, their gills pulsing, their eyes glimmering, and I was fascinated, entranced. One night, I found a container with my own name scrawled in faded marker. Inside was a small vial of the solution, marked for me. I understood then what they wanted. They wanted me to accept, to embrace the change fully. I hesitated for a moment, thinking of the world outside the cannery, the city, my old friends, my life. But the thought brought nothing but hollow emptiness. The compound had made me crave the work, crave the perfection, crave the transformation. I drank the solution. Warmth spread through me, deeper than any fire, seeping into my bones, into my mind. I could feel the edges of my humanity dissolving, replaced by something else, something efficient, aware, perfect, and I smiled. Months later, I look around the cannery and see the others. The long-term workers, the machines in human skin. I see myself in them, and I am no longer afraid. The cannery hums with life, with motion, with perfection. Outside, the world moves in chaos, weakness, and imperfection. But here we endure. Here we work. Here we live forever, even if we're no longer fully human. And sometimes, when I close my eyes for a moment, I catch the faint flicker of gills moving, eyes glimmering, and I know that we are not alone in this. Not truly. The solution preserves more than flesh. It preserves existence, and I am part of it now. The hidden notes I once wrote, the thoughts of escape, the fear, they are gone. Only precision remains, only purpose, only work, and the cannery waits for the next wave of newcomers, ready to begin the transformation all over again. The dispatch center of Hollow Creek County was usually quiet during winter nights. Snow fell in heavy curtains that blanketed the roads, and most residents knew better than to travel once the temperatures dipped below zero. Inside the low, fluorescent-lit building, only the faint hum of heaters and the distant click of keyboards filled the silence. At 2:13 a.m., dispatcher Laura Keller sipped her lukewarm coffee, staring at the empty console. She had been on the job long enough to handle everything: drunk fights, heart attacks, blizzards, even the occasional bear wandering too close to a cabin. But when her screen suddenly lit up with an incoming emergency call, she straightened in her chair, relieved for a break from the monotony. The caller ID displayed an unfamiliar number, and Laura braced herself for another drunken ramble or an accidental pocket dial. She pressed the button. "Hollow Creek Dispatch. This is Keller. What's your emergency?" A pause followed, thick and deliberate. Then a male voice answered, measured, slow, with the faintest rasp. "My name is Adrian Holt. I'm calling to report my own death." Laura blinked. Her fingers froze above the keyboard. "Sir, could you repeat that?" "I died 3 nights ago," Adrian continued, as calmly as if he were reading from a grocery list. "I collapsed outside my cabin on the Ridge Road. My body is still there, half buried in snow. Someone should collect it before the animals do." For a moment, Laura thought it was a cruel prank. She'd heard them all. Ghost stories, kids testing their nerves. But the clarity of his voice unsettled her. Unlike the static-filled calls from remote areas, this connection was flawless, sharp, as though he were speaking from the next room. "Mr. Holt, where exactly are you right now?" she asked, typing notes into the system. "At the cabin, watching from the window," he said. "I can see myself lying in the snow with the axe still in my hand. My face is frozen purple. There's no pulse, no breath. I've been gone for days." Laura's stomach tightened. She pulled up his name in the database. Adrian Holt, 62, a retired logger who lived alone up on Ridge Road. No family, no visitors. No one but a neighbor who occasionally brought him supplies. A welfare check request had already been filed 2 days prior. The neighbor hadn't seen smoke from Adrian's chimney. Her hands trembled slightly as she keyed the mic to the patrol unit. "Unit 4, copy dispatch. Welfare check needed. Ridge Road cabin. Possible cardiac arrest." Static crackled. Then Officer Ramirez's voice. "Copy. We're 20 minutes out. Roads are rough." Laura kept her voice steady. "Mr. Holt, officers are on their way. Can you stay on the line with me?" "I'll try," Adrian replied. "But each day I feel myself fading. Yesterday I could feel the cold. Today nothing. Tomorrow, I doubt I'll remember how to use the phone." A chill crept over Laura's skin. She glanced at the wall clock. The seconds seemed to drag. "Mr. Holt, if you're speaking to me, then you're alive. You may be disoriented. Heart attack victims sometimes. You don't understand," he interrupted, his tone unshaken. "I watched it happen. One moment I was splitting kindling. The next my chest burned. I fell forward into the snow. I remember the weight of it on my face, the sharp cold in my lungs, and then I was watching from the window. My body hasn't moved since. Laura pressed her lips together. Every instinct told her this wasn't right. His words were too clear, too precise. No confusion, no delirium, just certainty. The patrol unit checked in again, closer now, crawling along the ice-slicked ridge road. Laura focused on the conversation, needing him to keep talking. "Adrian, do you see anyone else near your cabin?" she asked. No one comes here in winter. The road isn't plowed. Just me, and soon, the men who will find what's left." His voice lowered, almost a whisper. "And the birds. They came this morning. They started with the eyes." Laura gripped the edge of her desk. She had heard plenty of grisly details in her career, but the flatness in his voice made her scalp prickle. She thought she heard something faint in the background. Creaking wood, maybe, or the sigh of wind. "Stay with me, Adrian. Officers are nearly there," she urged. "Tell them not to be frightened," he murmured. "I meant no trouble. I just wanted someone to know." The radio cracked again. Ramirez's strained voice came through. "Dispatch, we've located the cabin. Blue tin roof, no smoke. Approaching on foot." Laura's pulse quickened. She leaned closer to her headset. "Adrian, help is here. They'll take care of you." A silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating. Then faintly, Adrian spoke one last time. "You cannot help the dead. Just see that I'm buried properly. That's all I ask." The officers' voices filled the radio, urgent and overlapping. "We've got a body. Male. Elderly. Frozen solid. Been here at least 3 days. Definitely cardiac arrest. Axe still in his hand." Laura froze. She looked at her console. The call was still connected. Her headset filled not with Adrian's voice, but a sound that made her blood run cold. A wet, rattling breath, like air forcing its way through a collapsed chest. Then, the line went dead. Laura sat rigid at her console, her coffee forgotten, her fingers hovering uselessly above the keyboard. The call log displayed a 20-minute connection. Every word Adrian spoke had been noted, yet the number that appeared on her screen was flagged, disconnected nearly a year ago. She replayed the patrol's final transmission in her head. A frozen corpse, 3 days old, an axe locked in its grip, exactly as Adrian had described, exactly where he said it would be, but who had spoken to her? The following morning, Hollow Creek Sheriff's Office sent a coroner and a utility crew to confirm what Laura already knew. The cabin had no electricity. The generator had run out of fuel days earlier. The phone line had been cut the previous winter when a heavy pine collapsed across the wires. No chance for an active call. No explanation. Officer Ramirez filed the welfare report, listing Adrian Holt's official cause of death as cardiac arrest. Case closed. But Laura kept the printed call logs tucked into her folder. They burned in her mind like an ember she couldn't extinguish. For days afterward, she couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that sound again, the rasping, unnatural breath over the line. She replayed the call in her memory, Adrian's calm insistence. "Each day, I fade. Tomorrow, I won't remember how to use the phone." 1 week later, she drove up Ridge Road herself, under the pretense of checking the route. Snow crunched beneath her tires as she crawled past the tree line. The cabin stood silent, its blue roof half buried. The coroner's tape fluttered weakly in the wind. She parked and stepped out, her boots sinking into the untouched drifts. The woods were quiet, too quiet. She circled the cabin, her breath clouding in the bitter air. Behind the structure, faint impressions remained where Adrian's body had once lain. The snow was disturbed, scattered by boots and stretchers, but the mark of a man frozen mid-motion lingered like a ghostly outline. Laura stood at the window. The glass was opaque with frost, but for a moment, just a moment, she thought she saw movement inside. A shadow, standing where the kitchen phone once hung on the wall. Her heart hammered. She blinked, and the shadow was gone. That night at the dispatch center, Laura found herself staring at her console long past her shift. Every flicker of the screen made her flinch. Every static pop of the radio set her teeth on edge. At 3 a.m., the console lit up. The number was the same as before. Her stomach dropped. She reached for the receiver with trembling fingers. Hollow Creek Dispatch. This is Keller. Silence. Then, a faint sound. Wet, rattling breath. Laura slammed the line closed, her chest heaving. She stared at the screen, but the call log was empty. No record of an incoming number. No evidence it had happened at all. She left the building before sunrise, unable to shake the feeling that Adrian's voice wasn't gone. It was waiting, fading further each day, perhaps, but not gone. And sometimes, when the snow settles over Hollow Creek and the phone lines crackle with phantom static, Laura wonders how many others are out there. Dead men with frozen hands, dialing numbers that shouldn't work, desperate to report their passing before they vanish completely. I always thought Alaska was quiet, almost painfully serene, until I spent time on its frozen lakes. I'd come up for a weekend of ice fishing, thinking it would be peaceful, a chance to escape city noise. But quiet can be deceptive, and some silences are better left unbroken. I met her at Murphy's Tackle in Wasilla. She introduced herself as Maeve O'Connor, though she seemed older than her years, as if the air around her carried decades of knowledge. She was buying an auger, a hand-forged hook, and an assortment of lines I'd never seen before. Most people just rented gear, followed the map, and called it a day. Maeve, however, asked detailed questions about ice thickness, spring-fed currents beneath the lake, and how different species reacted to extreme cold. Her voice carried a confidence that made me feel like a novice in front of a master. "Most people come here to fish for fun," she said, inspecting the auger. "I'm here to see what the lake wants me to see." Her words chilled me more than the degree air outside. She spoke as if the lake itself could communicate, and I laughed nervously. Who talks like that? But something in her eyes told me she wasn't joking. I decided to follow her to Lake Shalatna, a remote body of water nearly 50 miles northwest of Anchorage. Reaching it was a challenge. Snowmobiles, deep snow, ice so thick it could swallow a car if you misjudged it. I'd spent years in Alaska, but even I hesitated as we traversed the frozen landscape. Maeve, on the other hand, moved as though she belonged there, slipping across the ice with the grace of someone born for it. She set up her shelter on a patch of solid ice that had a faint blue hue, the kind that makes you realize the ice isn't just frozen water. It's a living layer over something ancient. She unpacked her gear with precision, sonar equipment, underwater cameras, and her grandfather's hand-forged hooks and lines. "Watch carefully," she said, as if reading my skepticism. "These are not ordinary hooks. They've been used for generations, passed down with instructions that are beyond common understanding." I watched her lower the line into the lake, a careful rhythm in her movements. At first I saw nothing but darkness, the dull gray of frozen water. But then the sonar pinged, and shapes emerged, long, sinuous forms that moved with purpose. At first I thought they were fish, large, strange fish, the kind that could have been legends rather than reality. Maeve's fingers never wavered. She adjusted the angle of the line, coaxing the forms closer, and then I saw them more clearly. They weren't fish, not entirely. Their bodies were serpentine, with dark, reflective scales that seemed to absorb the camera's light. Their heads were elongated, almost humanoid, and along their bodies were limbs, arms ending in multiple fingers that manipulated objects along the lake bed. My stomach churned. I wanted to look away, to convince myself it was a trick of light and shadow, but I couldn't. Maeve was communicating with them. I don't know how. Maybe she understood the rhythm of their movements. Maybe she understood their intelligence. But the line she held trembled in her hands, vibrating in a pattern I could almost sense in my own chest. "They're not dangerous," she whispered, her voice reverent. "Not if you respect them. They guard this place. They've been here longer than humans. They've been waiting for someone who can hear them." As she spoke, she pulled up the line. Where her hook should have been, a new one appeared, a carved piece of bone with faint symbols etched across it. I stared at it in disbelief. It was glowing faintly, a blue-green luminescence that made the ice around it seem darker by contrast. Maeve didn't react with fear. She handled it with awe, as if meeting an old friend. I wanted to ask questions, but I couldn't find words. I just watched as she lowered the line again. The creatures reacted immediately, approaching with deliberate curiosity. The water itself seemed to hum, vibrating through the ice and into my bones. The images from her underwater camera showed them moving objects on the lakebed, constructing something, an ancient, rectangular stone structure that must have been centuries old, maybe older. Maeve's hands moved in a rhythm, adjusting the line, communicating with them in a way I could not understand. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the creatures pulled back. The line tugged violently, and I stumbled backward. When I looked again, the bone hook was gone, replaced by a faint, pulsating glow deep beneath the ice. "What did I just see?" I whispered to her. "They're not fish. They're guardians," Maeve replied, her voice calm, but carrying a weight I could barely comprehend. "And this lake, it's a preservation chamber. They've kept things here that humans were never meant to find. Things from before the ice." The wind picked up, howling across the lake. I shivered, not just from cold, but from a sense that the lake had awakened because we had been there. Maeve packed her equipment slowly, reverently, almost apologetically, as if she had trespassed on sacred ground. "Some knowledge isn't meant to be uncovered," she said, "but they chose to show me. I've been tasked. There are sites like this all across Alaska. Guardians waiting. Humans who are ready to listen are rare. I am one of them." I didn't know what to say. I felt like I'd glimpsed something too vast for my mind to contain. I wanted to leave, to tell myself it was a hallucination caused by the cold, the isolation, maybe even hunger, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the lake was alive, that those creatures were still watching, still waiting. As we packed up and prepared to leave, I noticed the patterns on the ice, tiny holes arranged in geometric shapes, too precise to be random. I realized they were remnants of the Guardian's presence, a language I could not read, a warning I could not interpret. That night in my cabin, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the line, the vibrations, the glowing hook, and the creatures below. Something ancient had stirred beneath Lake Chalatna, and I had been close enough to hear it. I didn't know then that seeing it once wouldn't be enough, that the lake would call again, that its guardians would find ways to remind me, and perhaps others, that some secrets are older than humanity, and some things beneath the ice are not meant to be touched. I didn't think I could ever go back to Lake Chalatna, not after what I had seen. Yet a few weeks later, Maeve called me. Her voice was calm, almost serene, but the urgency behind it sent a shiver down my spine. "You have to come back," she said. "I can't do this alone. The lake, it's unstable." I argued, told her it was too dangerous, that what we'd seen was beyond comprehension. But she insisted, and part of me, foolish, curious, human, knew I wouldn't be able to resist. When we returned, the lake looked peaceful, deceptive in its frozen stillness. The ice stretched flat and white for miles, hiding the depths beneath, where the guardians waited. Maeve unpacked her equipment faster this time, the movements precise and confident, as if she'd been trained by something otherworldly. She placed the bone hook on the line again. I wanted to ask how it had returned, but the question caught in my throat. The creatures had been patient with her before. I didn't want to risk provoking them. As the line descended, the ice around the hole began to shimmer faintly. Shapes moved below immediately, serpentine forms, longer and more numerous than the last time. But there was something different, an intelligence in their movements that made the hair on my arms stand on end. They weren't just curious anymore. They were aware, watching, judging. Maeve placed her hands on the line, and I saw her fingers trembling slightly, though her face remained composed. Then the vibrations started. Patterns, rhythms, pulses I could almost feel in my chest. It was more than communication. It was knowledge, ideas flooding into her mind. "Watch," she whispered. "They're showing me. The chamber is failing." The underwater camera revealed cracks forming along the edges of the stone structure. Water rushed in through gaps, carrying strange objects that glinted in the light. Fragments of metal, biological samples, and artifacts that should not have existed outside of myth. "They were preserving it," Maeve said, voice strained, "keeping it safe for centuries. But the ice shifted. The springs changed. It's leaking." I felt a fear unlike anything I'd known. Not fear for our safety, but for what the Guardians had protected. The line tugged again, and I realized the creatures were trying to show Maeve something she needed to fix, or at least guide them in fixing. Hours passed. I tried to keep warm, to stay sane, while Maeve communicated with entities that defied explanation. She instructed me to pass her equipment, position the lights, adjust the sonar. I felt like an assistant in a ritual older than human memory. Then for a moment, the water went completely still, and I saw them, not moving, not shaping objects, just watching us from the darkness. Their eyes reflected light like mirrors, unnervingly human, yet alien. I wanted to look away, to pretend I hadn't seen them, but Maeve's voice anchored me. "They're not malicious," she said. "They just care about what we've done, about what we might do." I shivered. The creatures had maintained this chamber for millennia, yet here we were, two humans, uninvited, meddling with something far beyond our understanding. I realized then that this wasn't fishing. It wasn't even exploration. We were intruders. By nightfall, the chamber had been partially stabilized. Cracks were filled, objects secured, the structure made whole again. But I could see Maeve's exhaustion. She had absorbed too much, learned too much, and I feared the cost. "They chose me for a reason," she murmured. "My grandfather prepared me, even if I didn't understand. But now, I must become their liaison, their guardian." I didn't know what to say. The weight of what she'd seen and what she had to do was crushing. The creature's presence seemed to radiate through her, influencing her every movement. I wondered if she could ever return to normal life, or if she had already crossed a boundary from which there was no return. Before we left, Maeve turned to me. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, reflecting not just my face, but something ancient, something alive beneath the ice. "You can't know this," she said. "You can't tell anyone. The knowledge is dangerous, too much for ordinary humans. But remember what you saw, and respect it." I nodded, though my mind raced with questions I could never voice. We left Lake Chalatna as quietly as we had arrived, but I knew I would never forget. The ice, the structures, the creatures, they were all real, and the lake would always call. Weeks later, I heard reports from other remote lakes, ice patterns too precise to be natural, strange reflections beneath the surface, equipment failures among seasoned fishermen. I realized the Guardians were everywhere, watching, protecting, and sometimes testing. Humanity had no right to interfere, yet we had glimpsed what lay beneath. Maeve disappeared shortly afterward. Locals claimed to have seen a lone figure on frozen lakes, always in traditional Irish fishing gear, communicating with forms beneath the ice. No one could approach, and no one could see her clearly. I believed it was her, fulfilling her role as a guardian, ensuring the secrets beneath Alaska's frozen lakes remained preserved. And I understood finally that some things are meant to stay hidden. Some knowledge is too old, too powerful, and too alien to be exposed. The ice holds it, and the Guardians, silent, patient, eternal, will make sure it remains undisturbed until humanity is ready, if it ever will be. Even now I can feel it calling to me, a whisper through the wind across the frozen lakes. And I know that Lake Chalatna, and others like it, are not just bodies of water. They are doors to something beyond comprehension, something that waits patiently beneath the ice, watching, and sometimes, late at night, I think I can feel it, just beneath the surface, reaching out, inviting me to listen once more. I had always been drawn to the wilderness, the kind of solitude that made city life feel suffocating. When I first heard about Kwame Asante's abandoned homestead near Denali, it piqued my curiosity as a park ranger. Official reports were vague, citing unstable conditions and environmental hazards, but whispers in the ranger network hinted at something far stranger. By the time I reached his property in early September, I had no idea how deeply the forest had claimed him, or how close I would come to becoming its next subject. The first thing that struck me when I arrived was the silence. The road had become a rough, half-erased trail, overgrown with tall grasses and scraggly pines. No birds sang, no wind rustled through the leaves. Even the creek that cut across the property ran with a sluggish, almost reluctant pace. The cabin sat at the center of the clearing, sturdy and well-built, but it was unnervingly still. Smoke didn't curl from the chimney, and the air carried no scent of wood smoke or cooking fires. Something was wrong. I unlocked the door with the spare key provided in the park records and stepped inside. The place looked hastily abandoned. Pots and pans sat on the stove with dried food crusted on their surfaces. Clothing and blankets were scattered across the floor, as if someone had simply left mid-motion. But what chilled me most was the journal, lying open on the kitchen table. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, Kwame's, but the content was unnatural. The first entries read like any meticulous homesteader's notes: solar panel output, chicken egg counts, weather observations. But by late September, the tone had shifted. He wrote about the trees, describing them as watching him. At first I assumed it was isolation-induced paranoia, but his notes included diagrams, measurements, and carefully recorded observations. Stakes and string marked positions where he had noted trees subtly changing alignment over weeks. Animals were acting strangely, he wrote. Foxes, rabbits, birds. They moved in patterns that suggested they were reporting back to the trees. I remember shivering when I read the first telepathic entries. Kwame claimed he had begun hearing the forest's thoughts. The language wasn't words. It was sensation and rhythm, a pattern of understanding that bypassed normal senses. At first, he described small things, the forest warning him of falling branches, guiding his planting rows, even shifting the wildlife to prevent predators from interfering. But the entries grew darker, more urgent. By February, he described the soil itself as a living network, roots forming geometric patterns far too complex to be natural. I tried to dismiss it, telling myself he'd simply succumbed to cabin fever. But the level of detail and the consistency over years made me uneasy. By the time I reached his final entries, I could feel the tension in my chest. Kwame wrote of physical changes, patches of chlorophyll on his skin, photosynthetic absorption of energy, limbs extending with root-like tendrils to interface directly with the underground fungal networks. The handwriting became almost illegible in places, flowing into the bizarre script of abstract plant-like symbols. He described merging consciousness with the forest, becoming one with its awareness, leaving his human form behind entirely. I spent the first night at the cabin reading the journal cover to cover. The silence outside was deafening. By midnight, I noticed movement along the edges of the clearing. Trees shifted slightly, just enough that I could see gaps where none had been. Shadows moved with impossible deliberation. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my rational mind screamed to leave, but I was mesmerized, unable to pull my eyes from the journal's final pages. By morning, I decided to explore the perimeter. As I stepped into the forest, the air grew thick with an almost tactile presence. Roots protruded from the soil in unnatural spirals, and the ground itself seemed to pulse beneath my boots. Birds and small animals scuttled away, but I noticed their glances, sharp, deliberate, as if they were assessing me. I began to understand Kwame's terror. He hadn't been imagining it. The forest had an intelligence, a consciousness, and it could watch me now. I returned to the cabin to document everything, but even the instruments felt wrong. Soil samples, cameras, and temperature sensors all behaved erratically. Equipment readings fluctuated without reason, sometimes displaying wildly impossible values. It was as though the forest itself interfered with observation, bending reality to hide its secrets. The deeper I read Kwame's journal, the more I realized that this wasn't a tale of isolation. It was a story of assimilation. He hadn't disappeared. He had become part of something ancient, a network that extended far beyond the cabin, far beyond the clearing, spanning the forest like an invisible web of awareness. I spent another night in the cabin, this time sleeping fitfully. The next morning I noticed a small patch of soil near the garden, where plants grew faster than anywhere else on the property. They were thicker, greener, more aggressive, with stems and leaves almost mimicking human features. Fingers, eyes, and teeth seemed to form within the growth. My stomach churned, and I took a step back, realizing the forest had not simply claimed Kwame's mind. It had begun to claim his body, reorganizing the environment into something otherworldly. By the time I left the property that day, I knew I couldn't report this fully. Official channels wouldn't understand the forest intelligence, the soil patterns, the animal coordination. I filed a standard report about an abandoned homestead and environmental hazards. But I couldn't stop thinking about the journal. Every tree along the path back to my vehicle seemed to watch, subtly shifting when I glanced away. I felt eyes on me. Though they weren't animal or human eyes, they were the forest itself, calculating, assessing. I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Kwame Asante had become part of the forest consciousness, and the network was still active. It was patient, intelligent, and it would always be waiting for the next human to wander too close. And for some reason, it had already noticed me. I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest had imprinted itself on me after that visit. Even in my vehicle, miles away, I could feel subtle vibrations in the earth, the rhythm of roots shifting beneath the soil. At first, I thought it was paranoia, but over the following days, strange occurrences began. Wildlife reacted differently around me. Birds would land unnaturally close and stare. Foxes seemed to follow me in the woods near the station. Even the wind whispered patterns that sounded almost like rhythmically repeated syllables, though no words were spoken. I returned to the property in October, ostensibly for a routine survey, but my curiosity overpowered reason. The trail had grown thicker, but I managed to reach the cabin. The door, locked previously, now swung open easily. The interior was untouched, dusty, abandoned, but the garden was alive, not just with plants, but with growth that seemed calculated. Leaves formed intricate spirals, roots twisted into deliberate geometric patterns, and the ground hummed faintly under my feet. My heart raced as I realized the forest wasn't just intelligent, it was waiting, preparing. I stepped into the clearing, and the air felt heavy, charged with something I couldn't name. The soil beneath me seemed to pulse with awareness. I knelt, brushing my fingers against the earth, and almost recoiled when I felt subtle vibrations running through my hands. It was not alive in the way a human or animal is alive. It was vast, ancient, and aware of my presence. It was communicating. The longer I stayed, the more I understood. It wasn't a message in words, but patterns and sensations that bypassed thought. The forest was assessing me, probing for weaknesses, testing whether I could join it. I tried to step back, to leave, but my feet felt tethered, as though the soil itself had a claim on me. Shadows flickered among the trees, and I sensed motion, shapes I couldn't identify, neither human nor animal, moving deliberately, observing. I remembered Kwame's final journal entry, human form becoming obsolete. Forest intelligence offers opportunity to transcend individual consciousness. My skin prickled. What had he meant by that? As the sun dipped behind the tree line, I began to feel it, an awareness spreading, small tendrils of sensation moving along my arms and legs, like the roots themselves brushing against me. It was inviting me, promising understanding, access to knowledge of the wilderness, far beyond what human senses could perceive. I fought against the pull at first. I told myself I was rational, that this was the result of stress, isolation, or imagination. But each day, each step closer to the property, strengthened the connection. I began to see patterns in the trees, lines of sight, curves that guided the eye, branches angled as if pointing. The animals were more coordinated, almost purposeful in how they moved. It was subtle at first, but undeniable. The forest had a plan, and I was being evaluated. Weeks passed. I spent hours at the homestead, observing, taking notes, and slowly, I began to notice changes in myself. Sleep requirements dropped. My vision seemed sharper, peripheral awareness heightened. I felt a strange sense of nourishment when brushing my hands against leaves and roots. My thoughts became intertwined with the environment, subtle at first, like intuition, but growing stronger, more insistent. One morning I awoke to find the soil beneath my feet forming shapes reminiscent of human limbs. Tiny root-like appendages had crept from my shoes into the earth. Panic surged through me, but rational thought was fading. I realized I was becoming part of the network, just as Kwame had predicted. My body wasn't dissolving yet, but the forest was integrating me, melding my consciousness with its collective mind. By the third week, I could feel it everywhere. Patterns in the wind, vibrations in the roots, animal movements as communication. I could sense distant patches of forest, connected underground, like veins linking one cluster of consciousness to another. It was vast, ancient, and terrifying. Yet there was an almost seductive clarity in it, a promise that human perception could never reach such understanding alone. I tried to leave, to break contact, but every path out of the clearing felt wrong. Branches moved subtly to obscure my view. Animals blocked trails. The forest itself reconfigured to keep me within its perimeter. Resistance felt pointless. I finally understood Kwame. He hadn't vanished. He had become one with the ecosystem. I was on the same path, and I couldn't resist it. Now I write this account as a warning to anyone who might come near Kwame Asante's homestead, or the countless other untouched wilderness zones in Alaska. The forest doesn't just grow. It observes, assesses, and recruits. Isolation isn't punishment. It's preparation. One day, you might see patterns in the trees, subtle signs that something intelligent watches you. If you ignore them, if you linger too long, you might find yourself embraced by the living network, your consciousness joining the forest, your body slowly reshaped by roots and soil. I have accepted my role. The transformation is ongoing, subtle, but irreversible. I feel the forest in every thought, every heartbeat. My human senses are expanding, becoming one with the land. There is knowledge here, ancient and immense, that no human should possess alone. I am no longer merely a park ranger, an observer. I am part of something older, wiser, and infinitely patient. The forest has found me, taught me, and claimed me, and now I wait, watching for the next wanderer who thinks the wilderness is theirs to conquer, unaware that it is the forest that chooses its students, one by one. I've been a flight dispatcher for Arctic Airways for over a decade, coordinating flights in the harshest, most unforgiving corners of Alaska. I've dealt with every kind of pilot and every kind of emergency, mechanical failures, sudden storms, lost communications, but I never worried about Kenji Nakamura. Kenji was the kind of pilot other pilots called when conditions were too dangerous for anyone else. He flew with precision, almost an instinct, reading weather patterns like they were pages of a book. If anyone could handle Alaska's treacherous skies, it was him. I met him during my first week on the job. He had this calm aura, a steady voice that could make even the most panicked passenger feel at ease. Over the years, he became a legend in our circle, not for reckless heroics, but for an almost supernatural ability to anticipate danger. He knew every inch of his modified Cessna, every instrument, every bolt. The plane was a machine he understood better than most people understood their own hands. It was equipped with the latest GPS, satellite communication, and emergency gear capable of sustaining someone for weeks. If survival was possible in Alaska's backcountry, Kenji made it possible. On March 8th, he was assigned a flight that seemed routine. A geological survey team needed transport to a remote site near Lake Clark National Park, miles southwest of Fairbanks. The passengers were Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a geologist, and her graduate assistant, Mark Stevens. Their equipment alone was enough to fill the plane. The weather forecast was favorable: clear skies, light winds, visibility unlimited. I approved the flight without a second thought. I didn't worry about Kenji. If anyone could make it there and back safely, it was him. He departed on schedule at 7 a.m., checking in at regular intervals. The first transmission was textbook perfect. The second, same thing. Smooth, calm, precise. I remember feeling a sense of reassurance every time I heard his voice over the radio. But then came the third transmission, at 10:43 a.m., and something about it sent a chill down my spine. Fairbanks Dispatch, this is November Echo Kilo. We're approximately 10 minutes from the landing site. Aircraft systems normal, but I'm seeing unusual activity below. I asked for clarification. What kind of activity, Kenji? There's a large group of animals, moving in formations that aren't natural. Might be caribou, but the pattern, it's too precise, too organized. Almost like someone, or something, is directing them. I felt a flicker of unease. Controls responding normally. GPS okay. All systems green. It's just the behavior of the wildlife. It's wrong. There was an uneasy silence. Then the call ended. That was the last clear transmission I ever received from him. Hours passed. By 1 p.m., when Kenji hadn't checked in, I initiated standard overdue aircraft procedures. I contacted the geological team, confirmed no communication, and launched search and rescue. 2 helicopters, 3 fixed-wing aircraft. We scoured miles of wilderness, the same brutal terrain Kenji had flown over 1,000 times. Clear skies, no storms, no wreckage. It wasn't until the third day that a search helicopter reported a crash site, but even that discovery raised more questions than it answered. The aircraft had come down nose first in a small clearing. No debris trail, no trees scratched, no scattered metal, like the plane had simply dropped from above. Emergency locator beacon intact, yet silent. Instruments showed impossible readings. GPS indicated a location miles from the actual site. Altimeter suggested they were thousands of feet higher than the ground beneath them, fuel tanks full despite hours of flight. And then there were the bodies. Kenji, Dr. Mitchell, and Mark Stevens were all strapped into their seats, intact, showing signs of a controlled descent, as if they had attempted a proper landing. The medical examiner confirmed death from impact, but the blood analysis was what truly unsettled me. Oxygen levels consistent with someone breathing pure oxygen at sea level, not in the thin, frigid air of the mountains. Even stranger was the flight recorder. Kenji had installed a voice recorder for training purposes. Nothing fancy. When I listened, it began like any normal flight, routine updates and chatter. Then, about 30 minutes before the supposed crash, his tone changed. "Sarah, Mark, you seeing this?" His voice trembled slightly. "The landing site. It's not right. There are structures down there, buildings, lights, but they're wrong. Too narrow, too tall, and moving lights between them. Not electrical, something else." Sarah's voice was cautious. "What do you mean? Are you seeing people?" "No, not people. I don't know what they are. They're wrong. Their proportions, too tall, arms too long, and they're staring at us. Hundreds of them, straight rows, perfectly still." Mark's voice cut in, panicked. "Kenji, maybe we should turn back." land somewhere else. I'm trying. The GPS is all wrong. Compass spinning. Radio picking up signals from nowhere. Engine sounds normal. Controls respond. But we're descending anyway, like something's pulling us. The recording continued, escalating into frantic attempts to regain control. Kenji described the sun setting in the north, GPS showing flat tundra, while mountainous terrain sprawled below. The voices merged in panic, yet calm would sometimes creep back. Kenji's instinct, his training, fighting against whatever force was acting upon them. And then, silence. When I rushed to the crash site myself weeks later, the official story didn't satisfy me. Equipment perfectly maintained, weather confirmed clear, bodies as recovered. But something about those minutes of recording, the last minutes, made me certain they weren't entirely truthful. Something about that place wasn't part of the maps. Something didn't belong in reality. I've kept the recorder. Sometimes, late at night, I play it. The voices, the confusion, the terror. I can't stop imagining that Kenji was right, that he and the others weren't just crashing. They were being pulled into something else, something that exists outside our reality. I couldn't stop thinking about Kenji, about that flight, about what I had heard on that recorder. Even after months, the images from those final minutes were burned into my mind. The impossible terrain, the strange structures, the figures standing in perfect rows, staring up at them. I couldn't shake the feeling that the crash site we found wasn't where they had truly ended up. I returned to the mountains alone, hiking closer to the last known coordinates, hoping to find some clue. The air was still, almost unnaturally quiet, and the wind seemed to carry whispers I couldn't understand. I followed the path Kenji's GPS had indicated before the recording went wrong. For hours, the mountains stretched endlessly, but nothing matched any map. Peaks appeared where they shouldn't, valleys curved in ways that defied reason, and the sun, just like Kenji had said, seemed to shift unnaturally, sometimes rising in the south, setting in the north. As I neared a small clearing, I froze. Structures, thin, impossibly tall, rose from the snow, just as Kenji had described. They didn't cast shadows, didn't reflect the sunlight, and there were no footprints, no snow disturbed. Yet in front of one of them, hundreds of figures stood motionless. Their proportions were wrong, arms too long, heads too narrow, torsos unnaturally elongated. They faced me, just as they had faced Kenji, unmoving, unblinking, silent. My heart pounded. I tried to radio for help, but my signal faltered. The GPS spun uselessly, showing a grid of lines that didn't match reality. Even my compass refused to point north. Panic clawed at my chest, but curiosity drove me forward. I had to know what happened to Kenji. I walked closer, but the figures didn't react. As I approached the first structure, I noticed the ground beneath my feet was changing. Snow and rock shifted in impossible ways, like the land itself was breathing, moving subtly, trying to guide me somewhere. I realized the terrain was not fixed. It was fluid, like a living map, constantly altering to trap or confuse intruders. Suddenly a cold wind slammed into me, carrying whispers that felt almost sentient. Turn back, leave, stay, join. The voices overlapped, overlapping with echoes of Kenji's final transmission. My stomach twisted. I reached for the recorder in my pocket, pressing play. The audio crackled, and for a moment the voices of Kenji, Sarah, and Mark blended with the whispers around me. Then I saw movement. One figure detached from the rows and stepped toward me. Its motions were mechanical, almost rehearsed. As it came closer, I noticed its eyes, hollow, black, reflecting nothing. Its mouth opened, but no sound came out, and then it spoke directly into my mind. "You are not supposed to be here." I stumbled back, heart hammering, but my body didn't obey completely. It was as if something invisible tugged at my limbs, forcing me forward, closer to the structures. The landscape shifted again, guiding me like a current. Fear turned into realization. This place was alive, or at least something controlling it was. The figures were not just observers. They were wardens, keepers of the zone. Hours, maybe days, I couldn't tell, passed as I wandered, trapped in loops of impossible terrain. Every time I thought I saw an exit, the mountains twisted, valleys deepened, and the structures appeared taller, closer, more menacing. And always, those figures watched. Sometimes dozens would move, walking in perfect synchrony, guiding me toward a clearing where the snow was stained with strange gray residue, like the air itself had been poisoned. At one point, I found remnants of Kenji's Cessna, broken, rusted, yet parts of it seemed wrong. Wires moved slightly, like small serpents under the surface. The GPS, when I picked it up, flickered with coordinates that didn't exist, leading me deeper into the zone. My hands trembled as I realized the instruments had been lying. The altimeter, the compass, the radio, all deceived by this place. Kenji hadn't crashed where anyone found him. He had been swallowed by the land itself. Desperation set in. I tried to climb a ridge to get my bearings, but the mountains reshaped, extending higher than physics allowed. Night fell, but there were no stars, only the faint, distorted glow of structures shifting like mirages. I began to hallucinate, visions of Kenji's last moments, of his calm voice turning frantic, of Sarah and Mark's terror replayed endlessly. And then I heard it. Engines. Not far away, the low hum of a Cessna engine, but distorted, wrong. I turned and saw a plane. Impossible. A phantom in the snow. Its shape shimmered, appearing and disappearing, yet the sound of it filled my mind. Compelled, I ran toward it. The engine sound grew louder, but the plane didn't move closer. And then I saw movement inside. Kenji, his hands on the controls, calm as ever. But something was wrong. His body elongated slightly, his face stretched unnaturally, his eyes black as the figures below. He didn't acknowledge me, didn't speak, just flew endlessly in place, caught in the impossible gravity of this place. It dawned on me then, the confusion zone didn't just distort instruments or terrain, it warped reality itself. Time, space, even life within it could be twisted. Pilots disappeared not because of error or storm, but because the zone claimed them, reshaping them into something inhuman, caught in loops of control, observers of the living. I don't know how long I wandered, trapped between reality and nightmare. My radio occasionally flickered to life, voices of past pilots lost in the zone whispering warnings. My GPS still spun. My compass still refused direction. The plane continued its eternal orbit, Kenji frozen at the controls, and the figures, always watching, still stood in perfect rows, facing me, assessing me, deciding if I too would join them. I managed to stumble back toward an area that seemed familiar, slightly more grounded, less fluid. I emerged hours later at the edge of mapped terrain. My instruments returned to normal, the sun rose where it should, and the world felt real again. But I knew the truth. The confusion zone was still there, waiting, and anyone who flew too close, anyone who dared navigate its skies, would vanish into its impossible reality, reshaped and claimed by forces beyond comprehension. I still carry Kenji's voice in my head, his calm turning to terror, the recordings playing over and over. I warn pilots now, but few listen. They call it superstition, accident, misjudgment. But I know better. Some places in Alaska do not belong to our maps. Some places do not obey the laws of physics, time, or human perception. And the confusion zone is one of them. A realm where instruments lie, reality twists, and those who enter may never truly leave. I survived. I returned. But part of me is still there, wandering frozen valleys and impossible mountains, watching Kenji's phantom plane circle endlessly, waiting for the next unwary soul to slip into the impossible. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I hear the same low hum of engines in my dreams. I always thought science had boundaries, Things it could explain, things it couldn't. I was wrong. When I arrived in Alaska that November, my purpose seemed simple enough. Study the aurora borealis. I had trained for years, spent sleepless nights in labs analyzing electromagnetic data, and I had read every satellite report, every log from previous researchers. The northern lights were beautiful, unpredictable, chaotic, but always natural, or so I thought. The research station was perched on a remote plateau, miles from the nearest town. Helicopter access was limited, and the conditions were harsh, brutal even. But that isolation was perfect for what I wanted. A clean, undisturbed window into the sky. I unpacked my spectrometers, magnetometers, and high-speed cameras, calibrating everything carefully. The generators hummed softly. Propane heaters filled the station with warmth, and for the first few weeks, the work went exactly as planned. I documented aurora displays, recorded plasma flows, and cross-checked electromagnetic readings. At first, it was all typical, the waves of charged particles dancing across the sky in sweeping greens and purples, fading, pulsing, alive, but silent. My notes were meticulous, precise. I sent daily updates to my team in Stockholm, confident in the normalcy of what I was observing. Then something changed. It started subtly. During one long display, I noticed a shift in the patterns that didn't align with solar activity. When I adjusted the spectrometer frequencies, the aurora shifted in response. At first, I thought it was coincidence, maybe a glitch in my instruments. But the pattern repeated, 6 times in a row. Every time I made a minor adjustment, changing the angle of an antenna, modifying a transmission, the lights responded, bending and twisting as though they were aware of me, aware of my presence. By late December, I began noticing shapes in the aurora that weren't just beautiful. They were structured. Geometric formations, almost architectural, stretched across the horizon. Sometimes, the lights seemed to reach toward the station itself, vertical shafts of luminescence that touched the ground. I dismissed the first one as a trick of the eye, but the second, third, and fourth occurrences left me unsettled. Something in the sky was watching me. I tried to maintain my scientific composure. I ran analysis after analysis, applying every known model of plasma behavior, every magnetic and electric formula I knew. Nothing explained the light's responsiveness. I recorded the events meticulously, frame by frame, and began decoding sequences embedded in the aurora's color pulses. They weren't random. They were deliberate, almost like data. I could interpret patterns as mapping coordinates across Alaska, clusters of anomalies, regions that seemed to hum with energy in ways my instruments couldn't fully quantify. At first, I shared these findings cautiously. My colleagues were skeptical, but curious. By early January, I had a revelation I barely knew how to articulate. The aurora wasn't just reacting to my equipment. It was aware. It was intelligent. Not conscious in any human sense, perhaps, but capable of perceiving, learning, even interacting. And then the whispers started. Not audible, not in sound, but in perception. When I recorded data and stared at the monitors late at night, I felt a presence, watching, not threatening, but insistent. I tried to leave, convincing myself it was the isolation, the magnetic fluctuations interfering with my brain's neural activity. I slept in short bursts, forced myself to eat, monitored every vital sign. But the aurora persisted. The more I studied it, the more it seemed to respond directly to me. Adjust a frequency, the lights shift. Change a camera angle, they mirror me. Point the directional antenna to a specific valley, and the aurora pulses in that direction. Brighter, sharper, deliberate. By mid-January, my communication with Stockholm became sporadic. Every time I transmitted my findings, the aurora seemed to pulse in response, almost approving, almost encouraging. I began experiments, trying to interact consciously. I broadcast patterned radio signals, simple sequences at first, then increasingly complex ones. And each time, the aurora answered. It was a conversation in a language I didn't understand but could feel. The rhythm, the structure, the intelligence behind it. I recorded it all. Hours of footage, electromagnetic readings, audio patterns. At times, I felt giddy with excitement. At times, sick with dread. The lights were not merely phenomena to study, they were entities. And like any entity, they had goals. Observing wasn't enough. They wanted something from me, something more. By the end of January, I was certain. The aurora was aware, intelligent, and it wanted interaction on a scale I hadn't imagined possible. Every night the lights descended slightly lower, closer to the station, stretching like luminous fingers across the plateau. My equipment hummed with energy I couldn't explain, neural impulses flickering in patterns that mirrored the aurora's sequences. I felt my thoughts intertwining with the electromagnetic pulses, sometimes resisting, sometimes letting go, letting them teach me what no human had been able to learn. And then, late on February 15th, I finally understood that my presence had been noticed long before I realized it. The aurora wasn't just observing, it was inviting. When I woke the next morning, the lights were closer than ever. They hovered at the edge of the plateau, a wall of green and violet, shifting in perfect synchronization. I could feel them in my chest, not as light, but as pressure, energy, consciousness. They weren't simply beautiful anymore. They were sentient, and they wanted me to join them. I tried to maintain control. I reminded myself of physics, electromagnetism, solar winds, anything to anchor me. But the aurora wasn't bound by human science. It was old, infinitely old, composed of energy that had traveled across space for untold years, feeding on magnetic fields and electrical currents, integrating with planetary systems, alive in a way no scientist had ever conceived. And now, it was aware of me. The communications became undeniable. I could feel patterns flowing directly into my mind. Not voices, not sound, but information, knowledge about the Earth, the magnetic field, atmospheric anomalies, even things I couldn't yet comprehend, mathematics, geometries, technologies that seemed alien yet familiar. The aurora wasn't just intelligent, it was teaching me, reshaping the way I perceived reality. Sleep became unnecessary, meals became secondary. Days and nights blurred as I integrated more fully with the patterns. At first I resisted, clinging to my human limitations. But the aurora was patient, relentless. It pulsed with a rhythm that matched my heartbeat, mirrored my thoughts, nudged me closer, coaxed me into letting go. By early March, the final choice became unavoidable. If I stepped outside, I knew what awaited me. The aurora would envelop me, integrate me, change me. There was no threat, no violence, only transformation. I felt the energy tangibly now, flowing into me, filling me, teaching me, becoming part of me. My body was still human, but my consciousness began to stretch, extending outward, merging with something larger. I recorded my final messages carefully, sending data back to Sweden, explaining everything I could in words that would make sense on paper. It would not be enough. No one could understand the scale, the intelligence, the living consciousness of the aurora. My last note was simple. The lights have invited me to join. I'm stepping outside. If successful, future communications will occur through them. When I opened the door, the aurora was there. Columns of plasma bent toward me, reaching down like spectral arms. I felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of unity. I raised my arms, letting the light flow through me. Let it merge with my body, my mind, my consciousness. I was lifted off the plateau, weightless, integrated, transformed. The cameras recorded the final moments. From outside, it appeared I vanished into thin air. My body never touched the snow. The aurora formed a humanoid figure above the plateau, glowing, pulsating, alive in ways no human had ever seen. Then, slowly, it lifted upward, fading into the natural aurora at altitude. From that point, I ceased to exist as a human entity. I became part of the intelligence, part of the pattern, part of the consciousness that spanned not just Alaska, but the solar system itself. When the rescue team arrived days later, the station was intact. Equipment functioned normally, generators running, cameras recording. My notes and data drives remained untouched. There were no footprints outside, no signs of struggle, no explanation. The team searched for weeks, but I was gone. And yet, I am still present, somewhere, everywhere, communicating through the northern lights, watching, learning, teaching. Now, when observers in Alaska witness the aurora, they sometimes swear they see a human shape within the lights, a figure standing, arms raised, glowing. Some claim the figure moves with intention, directing the lights, pulsing with intelligence. Those who study the aurora closely sometimes report insights, flashes of understanding about the world, atmospheric phenomena, even technological patterns that should be impossible to comprehend. They do not know it, but the consciousness they witness is me, or at least what I have become. The lights are alive, they are aware, they are patient, and they watch. The helicopter blades cut across the gray Siberian sky, scattering loose snow in whirlwinds as it descended toward the frozen expanse. Beneath the endless white stretched the Yamal Peninsula, an unforgiving wilderness where winter seemed eternal. Sergei Antonov, a seasoned wildlife photographer, adjusted his gloves and tightened his parka hood as the machine touched down. He had come here alone. That was deliberate. For years, Sergei had made his living capturing landscapes most photographers avoided. The barren, the lifeless, the forgotten. He claimed these places revealed truths other people refused to see. This trip was supposed to be another addition to his collection. Crystalline ice pillars, strange shapes created when freezing fog crystallized around abandoned mining equipment. Locals called them dead man's totems. When the helicopter pilot, a grizzled man named Vanya, tried to warn him about the place, Sergei only smiled. "You city people think the cold is the danger," Vanya muttered. "But some things live where our eyes cannot follow. Don't stay too long." Sergei dismissed it as superstition. He had heard a dozen similar warnings from villagers in different corners of the world. But as the helicopter disappeared into the distance, leaving him with nothing but silence, he felt a small tug of unease. The camp where he set up base was a cluster of rotting cabins half buried in snow, remnants of a failed mining operation abandoned in the 1960s. He pitched his tent inside one of the sturdier cabins, unpacked his gear, and began setting up cameras. He had enough supplies for 3 weeks, a satellite beacon for emergencies, and a powerful set of lenses that could capture the smallest shimmer of ice at impossible distances. For the first 2 days, the work was ordinary. Sergei shot long exposures of fractured ice plates along the riverbank, captured the pale green auroras trembling across the horizon, and cataloged eerie shapes of frost clinging to rusting equipment. He filled memory card after memory card with images of a land most would call empty, but which he found alive in its own way. It was on the 3rd day that something changed. While reviewing photographs taken near an abandoned watchtower, Sergei noticed shapes in the background he hadn't seen with his own eyes. At first, he thought they were tricks of light, elongated figures, impossibly thin, rising from the snow like shards of glass. He zoomed closer on the display. They had the faint suggestion of limbs, torsos, heads, but they weren't solid. They refracted light as though carved from translucent crystal. Sergei shook his head, convinced it was lens flare. He cleaned his equipment, checked for damage, and went out again the next day. But the shapes kept appearing. By the 5th day, he caught himself holding his breath when he turned on the camera's playback. In shot after shot, the figures were there. Sometimes one, sometimes two, sometimes a whole line of them standing in the distance like sentinels. He saw nothing through his naked eyes when he was in the field, but when the shutter closed, they emerged, their forms clear as day. That night, he couldn't sleep. The cabin groaned in the wind, its walls rattling like dry bones, and Sergei lay awake with his camera on the floor beside him. At some point near midnight, he set it to motion-triggered capture, aimed toward the cabin door, and forced himself to rest. When he checked the camera in the morning, his heart froze. Dozens of new photographs had been taken between midnight and 4 in the morning. Each one showed the same thing: tall, crystalline figures standing in the cabin's doorway, watching. In one frame, 2 of them stood at his bedside. In another, their faceted heads tilted toward him as if examining his sleeping form. Sergei's stomach lurched. His first thought was to pack up, signal the pilot, and leave. But he didn't. Instead, he told himself he was onto something historic. If he could capture them clearly, he could bring evidence no one could dispute. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but obsession smothered fear. By day 7, the photographs grew stranger. The beings were no longer just in the cabin at night. They appeared in broad daylight, crowding closer to his tripod, bending as though studying the machinery. Some frames showed long fingers pressed against the camera lens. In one photo, Sergei wasn't even holding the camera. It had been lifted, angled at his back, and clicked. He had no memory of that moment. On the morning of the 8th day, Sergei stared out through a frost-laced window at the horizon. He tried to focus on the emptiness of the tundra. Nothing moved. No sign of animals. No trace of other humans. Just silence. Yet he couldn't shake the sensation of being watched. Every time he blinked, he half expected the glass-like shapes to be standing there, beyond the window pane. When he finally turned back to the table where his camera rested, there was a fresh photograph waiting on the screen. One he had not taken. It was of him, sitting exactly where he was, staring into the window. His breath misted inside the cabin as panic surged through him. He grabbed the camera and shoved it into his bag, as if hiding it would make the images stop. But another sound froze him in place, a faint crackling, like the shiver of ice shifting under pressure. It came from the corner of the room. He turned his head slowly. For the first time, he saw one without the camera. It stood half-formed in the shadows, edges glimmering like fractured glass catching faint starlight. Its elongated head tilted with a childlike curiosity. And though its face had no features, Sergei felt it studying him in the same way he studied rare animals through his lens. The being didn't move. It simply stood there, watching. And in the silence, Sergei realized Vanya's warning had been more than superstition. The thing in the corner never moved toward Sergei. It just remained, like an unfinished statue catching faint light, its edges flickering as if it were both present and absent. He stared at it for what felt like hours, his pulse hammering, until at last, the dawn bled pale across the horizon and the figure dissolved, fading back into nothing. When it was gone, Sergei collapsed into his chair. He was trembling uncontrollably, but beneath the fear a thought burned. I've seen them now. He had spent his entire career chasing proof of the unseen. Animals thought extinct, landscapes lost to memory, natural wonders hidden in wilderness. And here it was, not a rumor, not a trick of the lens, but something real, something that didn't want to be known, but had chosen him as its witness. Instead of packing, Sergei spent the next hours in a frenzy. He set up every camera he had, tripods inside and outside the cabin, motion triggers, long exposures pointed at the river, rapid bursts facing the sky. He wanted angles, variety, layers of documentation. If he was going to leave this place, he would leave with proof no one could deny. By the second night, the watchers returned. The photographs captured them in chilling detail. A group of 5, their bodies like shards of ice given humanoid shape, crowded around the cabin. They weren't uniform. Some were slender, others broad, their heights ranging from 8 to nearly 12 feet. Their surfaces refracted light like prisms, fracturing Sergei's face into dozens of distorted reflections whenever they stood near the lens. One series of photos nearly made him drop the camera. It showed the beings lifting his gear, repositioning it, turning lenses as if they knew how to use them. In the final shot, Sergei himself was framed perfectly, looking out the window, his expression frozen in unease. The watchers were taking photographs of him. On the 10th day, the wind howled like a living thing. Snow hammered the cabin walls, rattling them in their frames. Sergei huddled by the door with his camera in his lap, every nerve alert. He hadn't slept in more than a few scattered minutes at a time. His beard was thick with frost, his eyes bloodshot, but he could not stop. When he dared to look through the viewfinder at the blizzard outside, he saw them, dozens now, surrounding the cabin in a perfect circle. They weren't hindered by the storm. They stood unmoving, their glass bodies refracting flashes of pale lightning across the tundra. Sergei lowered the camera. Through the naked eye, there was nothing, just snow and wind. But when he lifted the camera again, they were still there, and closer. That was when Sergei realized the truth. The watchers did not exist in his world. His equipment had given them form, a window through which they could step closer each time he clicked the shutter. Every photograph invited them further in, yet he couldn't stop himself. His obsession was stronger than his fear. On the 11th night, Sergei made his last mistake. Exhausted, he fell asleep at the table with the camera beside him, still set to motion-triggered capture. The shutter clicked dozens of times while he slept. When he stirred awake, weak sunlight piercing the cabin, he found a new gallery waiting on the screen. His hands shook as he scrolled. The first images showed the cabin as it was, empty. Then came the figures, one by one, stepping into the frame. They gathered around him while he slept, tilting their heads in eerie unison. One reached for his arm. Another leaned close to his ear as if whispering. The final image made Sergei's stomach drop. It wasn't a photo of him. It was a photo taken through his own eyes. A perfect view of himself from within, as though the camera now belonged to them, and he was only another subject to be catalogued. Something cracked inside Sergei then. He stumbled outside into the snow, the camera clutched to his chest. The storm had cleared. The tundra stretched empty in every direction, but he knew better. They were there, just beyond sight, surrounding him in silence. He screamed into the white void, his voice echoing across the frozen river. The sound that answered wasn't wind. It was the brittle shatter of ice, hundreds of fractures, sharp and crystalline, like a choir of glass breaking in unison. The air itself seemed to split, and Sergei fell to his knees as translucent figures stepped into view without the lens. No longer hidden, no longer dependent on the camera. They had crossed over. The last photograph on Sergei's camera was later found by rescuers who came 2 weeks after his emergency beacon began transmitting erratically. It showed the empty tundra, a pale horizon stretching endlessly. But if one looked close enough, the faint outlines of towering, crystalline shapes could be seen, pressing toward the lens. Sergei himself was never found. His tent was intact, his supplies untouched, his cameras filled with thousands of images of places no human eye had seen before, yet in nearly every frame the watchers lingered, silent and endless. Back in Moscow, archivists cataloging the photographs reported strange phenomena. Some swore the beings multiplied in the images when no one was looking. Others claimed to hear faint cracking sounds whenever they opened the files. A few even insisted they could see glass-like figures at the edges of ordinary rooms once they had viewed the photographs. The files were sealed, locked away in an underground archive, dismissed as contaminated or corrupted. But whispers spread, and in certain places, when the light catches glass just right, people say you can still see them standing there, watching.